Hi, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you who are joining us today for this very exciting pre-launch of the BEP 100 Monograph. The fact that you're here on a Sunday afternoon and that there are actually no CPD points involved for this webinar shows that you are truly interested in the subject matter. My name is Yvonne, and I'm your host and moderator for this afternoon. We have participants joining us from many different locations today. For those of you calling in from overseas, from London, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand, a particularly warm and balmy Malaysian welcome to you. Now, popping up in front of your screens right now, you will find a quick poll that we would like for you to take. So while working on the book, one of the things that we have been eager to discover is how wide the BEP network has extended since its existence. So if you would just take 2 seconds to make a selection on your screens, it will help us to get a quick overview of our audience today. As we wait for the results to pour in, let me just give you some quick guidelines on how the webinar will work. We will have 4 people on the virtual stage to give an overview of the book. We will also be hearing from the writers on their approaches and thinking behind their writing. And since this book is not meant to be a full stop on the BEP narrative, we will look at new discussions and opportunities that this book will present. As we go along, if you have questions or comments on any of the materials being presented, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to lodge your questions. It should be somewhere right at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will try to respond to as many questions as possible as the webinar progresses. So don't hold back and wait for a Q&A session at the end. For those of you who haven't clicked on the poll, please take some 2 seconds to do that, and we will be able to see some results as it happens. For those watching this video after this live session, please use our Facebook page to ask more questions if you have any, and we will be thrilled for the conversation to keep going beyond this webinar. And yeah, let's take a look at the poll results now. Okay, so we have about maybe 50, a little bit over 50% of people who have actually worked with BEP in some capacity or are currently employed. I hope this doesn't count towards your overtime for this afternoon. But we're also glad to have about 46% of you who don't actually know BEP, but are here to find out more about what and who we are. So we do welcome all of you, and we thank you for joining us this afternoon. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists today. First up, we have Professor Robert Powell. He's a critic, architect, and city planner. He's the author of numerous books, many of them centered around the works of Southeast Asian architecture. In fact, just yesterday, he helped to launch a book in which he wrote a foreword for. He has also spent many years teaching at the National University of Singapore and in a more recent position as a professor of architecture at Taylor's University right here in Malaysia. He is currently technical advisor to the Think City Institute. Next up, the younger gentleman is Dr. Simon Soon. He's a senior lecturer teaching art history in the visual arts program at the University of Malaya. But he has a much broader interest on comparative modernities in the arts, urban histories, and art historiography. He too has published many writings on various topics related to 20th century art across Asia, and occasionally curates exhibitions as well. He is also a key member of the Malaysia Design Archive, a repository, education, and research platform on visual cultures of the 20th century. Last but not least, please let me introduce you to Liyana Hasnan. She's a researcher and educator focusing on architectural history and theory. Her work investigates cultural, historical, and political rhetoric within the discourses that have defined the architecture discipline. More recently, in 2017, after completing her Master of Architecture in Columbia University, she co-curated the exhibition Manifest, Modernism of Merdeka at the Petronas Gallery, which also led to the publication of the KLAF 2017 logbook. So these are our speakers for today, and we will start with an overview of the book. We want to be able to give you an insight into what you will find in these 450 pages of the BEP 100 monograph. So let us kick off our speakers this afternoon and begin with Simon Soon, the author of chapters 1 and 2 of the BEP 100 monograph. Over to you, Simon.
All right, thank you, Yvonne. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to try something different rather than feed you with, a slide of images. Please have a look in the chat box. What you will find. Wait, let me do this first. Okay, so please have a look in the chat box. You'll find a link to an ArcGIS story map that I've created. I figured that since many of you are probably multitasking anyway, why not be distracted by the 3 digital maps that I've created, essentially giving you a sense of BEP's relationship to Kuala Lumpur. So I wish I had more time to, flesh it out further, but trying to pinpoint where all those factories designed and built in the 60s are actually located really took a very long time and took a lot of the cross-referencing sort of effort was, it took a long time. So it's something that I will continue to work on, but for now, at least feel free to explore, wander around, and as you listen to me speak. So in chapter 1 and 2, what I was, I guess, tasked with was to tell the early history of the firm. The 2 chapters cover 2 time periods really separated by the Second World War. Therefore, I guess in trying to write them, these chapters represent very different set of challenges. In chapter 1, covering the pre-war period, I think the biggest challenge for me and for us really was that we didn't really have that much to begin with. So Coltman himself said that most of the business documents were lost during the war. And we have a memoir written in 1957 that gave us a bit of an idea. And then we were really required to sort of flesh this out and verify what was being shared with us in that particular memoir. So I remember at one point being in Singapore, having just arrived with a bunch of students, not more than an hour ago, and we were already heading out to Jurong to visit the Heritage Conservation Center. But at the same time, I was also on my phone throughout the entire journey with Yvonne on the other side and sharing with her the timeline that I've scrambled together on my flight to Singapore, going through every single bit of newspaper report that I can find on Ralph Booty and Sydney Edwards and reading, and both of us reading them against Edwards' memoir and then debating on how to interpret the year the firm where the architectural practice was actually established. So that was like, a huge sort of like learning experience for me. But I think with the second chapter, we were on firmer footing, and this challenge, I think the challenge was then how to situate the firm's practice within a larger changing cultural, political, and economic landscape, as independence was on the horizon. This is, of course, not to lose sight of very personal voices to help us see beyond, what we call the grand ethos of that era, as well as the historical contingencies of that time. But I think the memoirs of then Francis Bailey and Arthur Coltman offer a really nice counterpoint to these larger narratives, because in them, you get to hear an individual's voice and a story about one person trying to figure their way around the world, and learning that architecture would be so central to the meaning that they want to create out of their life. And if their career mirrors or reflects the trials and tribulation of this thing that we call Malaysia, then the memoirs really suggest that this is only one part of the story, and there are other aspects of their life that are perhaps also worth paying attention to. And these are the details that are probably of little consequences, For example, like how spiritually inclined Francis Bailey was, or that he was very much a family-oriented man. But I think these details figure as much in his telling of his past, and therefore perhaps also in some ways we can entertain the idea that there might be some kind of like connection to his practices that that hasn't been sort of like discussed at length, that probably is worth exploring in the future. So while architecture history, written in the conventional sense that prioritizes form and spatial analysis, might not always find these details arresting, I was given wide enough berth by the editors to approach the first two chapters as a cultural and social historian, rather than dwell on the construction technicalities or the formal qualities of the buildings. I was looking for ways that we can develop a broader definition of what constitutes sensibility, perhaps trying to suggest that buildings appeal to our sense perception, not just on formal terms or spatial terms, but also because they signpost so many different types of contested visions, ideas, and issues that we're constantly grappling with as a society. This is with the hope that when I'm emphasizing all of these, we might discover why these buildings continue to remain meaningful to us today.
Okay, thank you, Simon. That's a very broad and wide overview of how to approach this and how we look at history as well, isn't it? So thank you for that. That's the overview of chapters 1 and 2. So there's a question here from Huat Lim on the motivation behind the book. So we'll come to that in a bit after all the presenters have presented an overview of the chapters. But I do encourage anyone who has questions to put it into the Q&A box instead, so everyone can actually see your question as well. Now we'll hand the stage over to Robert Powell, who's going to take us through chapters 3 and 4. So please welcome Robert Powell.
Thank you, Yvonne. Let's just get the slides up. 1 second. Okay. Well, thank you, Simon. I was tasked with writing chapters 3 and 4 on the end of the empire and Malayanization and the next generation. But let me backtrack a little. Ralph Booty was a Singapore-based South African surveyor of tin mines and rubber plantations in Malaya in the early 20th century. He operated out of Singapore. And on March 14th, 1921, just over 100 years ago, he took a classically trained English architect, S.J. Edwards, into partnership. Edwards was a mathematics graduate of Cambridge University and trained at the Royal Academy under Sir Aston Webb, the president of the RIBA and the designer of the main frontage of Buckingham Palace. In 1925, Edwards won a competition to design Colombo Town Hall in Ceylon, as it was called then. He moved to Colombo and formed another practice with Reed and Booth that later employed Geoffrey Bower. Colombo Town Hall was completed in 1928. Edwards didn't return to Singapore, and the practice was taken over by Arthur Coltman, another English-born, and it was also English-born, but trained in South Africa, and he joined the firm in 1925 and moved Booty and Edwards' architectural practice to Kuala Lumpur in 1929. He eventually bought the practice from Booty in 1932 and retained the name. Coltman was the designer of the Lee Rubber Building in 1930, the Oriental Building in 1932, the Rubber Research Institute of Malaya in 1936, the Anglo-Oriental Building in 1937, and the OCBC Bank, now the Think City headquarters. All these buildings you will have seen if you're often in the center of Kuala Lumpur. He also laid out the Kenny Hills estate. Another Englishman, Francis Bailey, joined Booty and Edwards in January 1953. From 1954, he supervised the construction of the Brunei Royal Mosque, designed by Coltman. He designed a number of other buildings in Brunei and was taken into partnership in 1956. Bailey's design for the Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool in 1968 took a second prize in the international competition won by Sir Frederick Gibbon. Booty and Edward's name became overnight known beyond Malaya and led to the opening of a London office. Bailey was an expert in hyperbolic paraboloid roofs, and these were employed by Bailey on several buildings, including the Good Shepherd Catholic Church in Kuala Lumpur. And later in his career, not an hyperbolic paraboloid, but he designed St. Joseph's Cathedral in Kuching in 1968. He was a devout Catholic, and he understood the changing liturgy of the church. Kington Loo was taken into partnership shortly after Francis Bailey, with a view to him running the KL office after Malaya achieved independence in August 1957. And here you see some of his notable buildings, including Zoo Nagara, Wisma Damansara, Tanjung Aru Beach Hotel, and Regent Hotel in Kuala Lumpur. In 1957, Copeman retired from the practice to live in East Sussex in England. But the next 10 years were the most prolific period in that era of Francis Bailey and Kington Loo. They included the Anglican Church at Terendak Camp in Malacca, the Duan Tunku Chancellor won in competition by Francis Bailey, and Subang Airport, designed by Bailey and brought to fruition by Kington Loo and Ronald Pratt. 1968 effectively marked the end of the British involvement in Booty Edwards and Partners. In the run-up to Malayanization, enshrined in the 1970 New Economic Policy, the practice split into two entities. I named this chapter The End of an Empire, as Bailey and his associates departed for London and Brunei, and Kington Loo took over the running of the Kuala Lumpur office. Booty Edwards and Partners became BEP Akitek. BEP Akitek were active in Singapore and worked with IMP on the iconic OCBC Center in Singapore. They designed the TAS Center in Singapore and Duan Bandaraya Kuala Lumpur, the DBKL building, was designed by Dato Zahani of BEP Akitek. Dayabumi and the GPO was designed by Kampak Chong in BEP in association with Mir Shah Rehman of MAA Architects. And I marveled at this building when I first came to KL in 1985. It was the focus of the center of Kuala Lumpur. The Putrajaya Master Plan in 1985 was proposed by BEP Architect team and was selected by PM Tun Mahathir for development. BEP Architects became a leading practice in design of high-rise and low-rise residential developments. Notable projects you see here are Rihanna Green, Sendana, and Desa Park City. Kampak Chong has led the practice for 2 decades and has made provision for future leaders. Some recent projects you can see here by BEP Architect include the Light Collection 3 in Penang, Rumah Hotel and residences in KL, the V residences in Penang, and Emerald Bay at Puturi Harbour in Johor. So here, the current directors of BEP Architect confer on the format of the book. It's now a highly successful practice with a group of directors in place that are design oriented, that will see them into the next 100 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, for your presentation of not just chapters 3 and 4, but actually it's a presentation of the architecture that these 5 chapters in the book represent. So thank you for that quick overview. In chapter 5, Liyana Hasnan will take us through and give us an overview of what and how she approaches chapter 5. Thank you, Liyana.
Thank you, Yvonne. Okay, so chapter 5 covers BEP Architect in the 21st century. The chapter's aim is not only to describe their latest works, but also to locate them within a larger context of the field. Sorry. So in 1988, an exhibition was held at the MoMA, New York, titled Deconstructivist Architecture, which sparked the movement and its subsequent discourses. It was an example where exhibitions not only archive and reflect shifts in the architectural field, but also initiated it. On this premise, BEP's work was written to parallel the shifts in the field as represented at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Hans Holstein's 1996 Biennale theme was Sensing the Future, the architect as seismograph. He wanted to investigate the architect's ability to capture underground vibes of present times and translating them into the future. Similar to a seismograph machine that detects shifts in the seabed anticipating earthquakes, BEP Akitek's predictive quality has been noted on several occasions, evident in breakthrough residential concepts such as Desa Kodalari in 1984 as the country's first condominium, and Mikasa All Suite Hotel in 1988, the first service apartments in Malaysia. This pioneering spirit demonstrated the firm's ability to anticipate the future needs of society. The 2000 exhibition led by Massimiliano Fuxas, adeptly titled Less Aesthetics, More Ethics, focused on finding an ethical way to relate to architecture. The internet has given clients access to stock images of building designs, increasing requests that prefers form over function, iconography over purpose. While BEP recognized the challenge of dealing with form and space, they remain rooted in the ethos of function over form, a value that have contributed to their long years of practice. Next was Dean Suchik's Biennale title, which looks to reveal the traces and elements for future projects by investigating the architect's studio. Young directors summed up BEP as more like an institution rather than an office. If previously cups were divided into an order of seniority, they are now more like a family. Today, colleagues work as a collective. They have identified among themselves their individual strengths and have disassociated themselves from the idea of architecture as the product of a single voice. Aaron Betsky's theme for the Biennale was titled Out There, Architecture Beyond Building. Betsky wanted to reflect on a dimension of architecture that moves beyond the notion of making things into an idea that has more to do with thinking and arguing about building. BEP Akitek takes education to a personal level, believing the responsibility of grooming the young architects was crucial for the office. Colleagues were also encouraged to dedicate time giving talks and doing crit sessions at universities. BEP saw the importance of young architects. Quoting James, Mr. Kam told me that he wants to bring in new blood. He wants to make the company young and not let it grow old. The Venice Biennale in 2018, Free Space, was curated by Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara of Grafton Architects. It was only the second time when female directors were appointed after Kazuyo Sejima in 2010. There is no lack of women architects, designers, and draftspersons who have joined and are still part of BEP. The inclusion of women adds to the firm's diversity, echoing its historic move to be the first practice in Malaysia to hire a female draftsperson. Hashim Sarkis's current Biennale proposes a turning point to ask how architecture can help humanity live together. In 2019, the world listened to Greta Thunberg's voice in response to climate change. The architecture world followed suit by taking up leadership roles in conversations to address the challenges of designing buildings and cities in the face of environmental crises. Last year, the world faced a pandemic that continues to affect our lives and our ways of living and how we now perceive spaces. So Sarkis's theme challenges the profession to not just design better spaces for better living, but gauge how successful architects are at transposing the people to better lives through the glossy images that they produce with architecture. As food security and economic diversification become the top concern in our current environment, it is encouraging to see BEP Akitek is involved in creating a solution for a non-traditional farming method. After a century, BEP Akitek is far from throwing in the towel and is instead looking forward to another 100 years with determination. And even with challenges ahead, they can expect to once again lead with an architecture wholly conditioned by the unprecedented requirements of the new world. Thank you.
Thank you, Liyana, for that overview of Chapter 5. Before we go on, I'd like to answer a question that Mr. Huat Lim has actually posed to us. His question is, how did the book begin and what was the motivation behind the book? Well, this may not be a public knowledge or not so well known, but just 2 weeks ago, BEP celebrated her 100th birthday. It was actually in March 1921, where S.J. Edwards joined Booty in setting up an architectural section for the practice. So we see that as the beginning of the firm, and therefore we felt it was only right that in March 2021 that we do a pre-launch of this book. And this book is not just a collection of projects that the firm has done over the last 100 years. We actually see the book as an opportunity to capture and to put down in writing not just what's over the last 100 years, but what are the conversations that this book will actually engage in. How does it change the way we look at the history of Malaysia? How does it change the way we write history? So that was one of the motivations and story of how the book began. Now, some of you may be wondering, you thought that you were attending a webinar about BEP and architecture, but what are we talking about the Biennale, about World War II and the Japanese? What's the relationship between all of that? So I think it's only right that at this point, we want to go a bit behind the writing. We want the writers to tell us what were their thought processes when they wrote their essays. So perhaps beginning with Robert Powell, Robert, maybe as the one who's most published among all the writers, how did you approach your writing for this large period of time, the chapters 3 and 4, from the 50s to the 80s, the time where BEP's most recognizable buildings were built?
Yvonne, I always say that writing a book is like taking a journey without a map. The enjoyment comes really from the discoveries that you make along the way. There's no telling what you're going to discover, no telling what you're going to unearth. And that really gives me a great thrill. The book has been several years in the making. I know that you started doing the initial research in 2012, and I came along in the middle of 2018 to write just 2 chapters. And I discovered that there were many myths that had been perpetuated about BEP, specifically about Kington Moo, over the years. And thorough research revealed an altogether truer version, authentic story. And that was really the thrill of writing for me. And it always is. I mean, even books that I've written about houses or about terrace houses, just finished writing a book on terrace houses. It's all about discovery on the journey that you make. And this was particularly interesting for me because BEP is the oldest extant practice in Malaysia. There is not another practice that has been here for 100 years. Maybe Swan and McLaren might contest that, but yeah. The argument is that BEP have been here for 100 years. So it's not just about architecture. It's about a changing culture from a colonial culture, an empire, to the birth of a new nation and the subsequent development of that nation. And Simon nicely introduced that in his first 2 chapters. And my job was, as I saw it, was to read all these transcripts of many hours of interviews that were done by yourself, by Kampak Chong, by Kamal Merikan, by Ho Wai Ping, by Hafiz Amaral, by Ahmad Johari, and to pore over these thousands of words that had been transcribed. Then there was some really interesting handwritten correspondence from Francis Bailey and Kington Lew, which disclosed their relationship with other directors, but also as early as 1957, Kington Lew was writing about what is Malayan architecture, subsequently what is Malaysian architecture, what distinguishes it from other architecture. I pored over Arthur Coltman's account of his 32 years in practice in Malaya, I should say, including his internment in Changi prisoner of war camp in the Second World War. I read through Francis Bailey's draft autobiography, which covered his wartime experience in India, Burma, and Singapore, and his deep Catholic convictions. And I consulted plans and pictures as well. So effectively, I mined for information, endeavored to extract an authentic account of the history of BEP. That for me was the thinking behind the writing. I wanted to know what was going on behind this firm, and who were the characters, and what difficulties they encountered, and how they overcame those difficulties.
Thank you, Robert. So that's certainly something that is quite true. Often we look at architecture and we think that they are built products, and we look at them as brick and mortar, but we tend to forget the people who are actually behind these buildings. So another question that we see here in the Q&A, is BEP a firm that has both aspirations to be commercially successful or intellectually radical? Your firm suggested changes and ramifications. Do you see BEP changing the next 100 years into yet another entity? Liyana, would you like to make a comment on this question? As the writer of chapter 5, looking beyond 100 years, what do you think?
Thank you for the question. I think it was Huat Lim. Right. Yes, I do believe that they will, changes will be had, especially now the younger generations are taking over. There'll be no doubt some changes towards the direction that the whole company will take yet again, because I don't think change was something that the company fears. I think it was what they accept and embraced. And I think towards another 100 years, you would probably see BP as, a 2 or 3 newer version of BPs, depending on the generations that sort of like enters them. So I hope that answers your questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Perhaps now we'll move on to Simon. So Simon, what was your thinking behind the writing that you did? You had to write about a period of time, from 1920s through to World War II, and admittedly, the BEP archives didn't have much documents or documentation from that period, except for a manuscript, a precious manuscript from A.O. Coltman. So how did you approach your writing and go about that?
Yeah, actually, I like to echo Robert in the sense that the joy of writing is really the journey that it takes you, right? And I think, if I were to write the chapters today, I would have written it very differently, but I say that about everything that I've written. For me, the challenge for chapter 1 was really, as you described it, at the very beginning, we only had Coltman's memoir to guide us. Over time, of course, I've learned how to sort of access historical newspaper, and that provided a very useful sort of source for cross-referencing and verifying details. And then later on, more materials began to sort of surface in archives in Singapore and Malaysia. I guess I wish I was more knowledgeable about the National Archive back then, and how to navigate through it. My regret was that my skill was not up to par back then. Otherwise, I imagine there could be interesting things that we could discover that could be useful as a form of triangulation. But I think I maybe would like to acknowledge that there's also a whole range of literature that I've read around any topic that is addressed in the book. So for example, to understand KL in the 1930s, I really spent quite a lot of time trying to also understand what was KL like before. Already then, writers were saying that an earlier KL was vanishing in front of their eyes as buildings were coming up left, right, and center. So to fully understand what this could mean, you know, it really sort of like led me down a rabbit hole. Therefore, understanding the change in 1930s KL meant that I had to go back to read late 19th century newsletters, for example, printed by the European community. Or in another example, trying to figure out PJ's beginning meant also to really try to understand what was there before, the history of the estates and the indentured sort of laborer settlements that once occupied those grounds. Of course, the breadth and scale of these contexts cannot just be justifiably presented in total in the book. Otherwise, we run the risk of watering down the story we want to tell in the first place. But I think it is this type of peripatetic exploration that gave me a better appreciation of a time and place. It didn't occur to me before, but you know, I'm also sort of like through writing this 2 chapters, I've also been developing research skills that led me later on to develop a guide to digital resources and resources on colonial history. So if you're interested in that, you can actually, I'm going to share the link in the chat box. And it's a resource that's used by librarians and scholars from different parts, from all over the world. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. So in relation to that, we actually had a question from Imran Chin asking about who are the target audience for this book. Should it be for the younger generation or is it more for future generations? How do you see that as a historian?
I should hope so. I mean, one would hope that the younger generation will take interest in a book like this. I mean, it's rich enough as a story, hopefully to entertain, but to also inform and to educate. That's coming from someone who actually likes books.
I interject, Yvonne. There are several questions up there that the one from Dr. Tan Lukman, which says I recall BEP held a view that they were never very keen on architectural awards. My impression, whilst reading or interviewing and reading the various texts, that's still the case. That winning awards is not their main focus. They value the decision of the industry. People come to them for a design of residential buildings, design of commercial buildings, and they believe that I think is based on their reputation that they can deliver. The other question I see there is from Susan Zeidler. It says, what is their current design philosophy? Well, it's difficult sometimes to detect what the current design philosophy is, but it seems to me that BEP in their 100 years started with classicism. They went through Art Deco. They became one of the leading exponents of modernism in the Sime Darby building, the Liverpool Cathedral, in Subang Airport. They excelled in brutalism in Duan Tunku Kansala, and then they went into some neo-vernacular. The postmodernism was briefly addressed in things like the Renaissance Hotel. And then architecture is a sort of regional modernism, I think, in St. Joseph's Cathedral, in Balai Pelda, and in Dayabumi. And so there is a philosophy, I think, develops all the time, and it is changing. It's not static. And I believe that they will change and stay ahead of the game in the coming century as well. So it's not a static thing. They're constantly responding to society's needs and cultural needs.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. keep those questions coming. We will try to get through them as we go along. But right now, maybe let's hear from Liyana. Liyana, who wrote chapter 5, has actually paralleled the firm's trajectory along with the biennales that have been happening. There's also a bit of crystal ball work that Liana had to do in pitching and looking forward to the future. So how did you see this happening, Liana, and what guided your thoughts when you were writing chapter 5?
Thank you, Yvonne, for that question. So I have to address that I inherited chapter 5 from R+, specifically Farashila and Kalisa. And they have done a great job at initial research and interviews. So I came into the job as an editor. So shifting the job scope from editing to writing a whole chapter became somewhat easy, especially the era that I was set to write about, which was the final decades. And your question sums up my, it sums up what went through my head when I began. It was how to write The Office not as a past tense, but in present continuous tense, in a way how to anchor the present towards a future. So of course I went through, flipping many El Croquis and architecture books to see how, those writers write about office practices. But it was only until I reread the book Almanach, it was a book by OMA, jointly written by AMO, that I thought I could use this. So Almanach was like a measuring instrument to the changes taking place in the Arab world. To me, it was not just a reflective document, but also a critical piece that looks for justifications, reasons, and accountability. So it was this type of critical practice that I saw I could sort of like extract from BEP Akitek. And I guess, I was already, from my exhibition experiences, I was already drawing similarities between exhibitions and books. So exhibitions like the Architecture Biennales have become a medium to have the larger public engage with architecture. So in a way, the book is also a medium for the public to engage with the firm. So paralleling the themes of Venice Biennale to BEP Akitek became my instrument or method for me to ground the office to the larger context and also the existing discourses in architecture. So that was it. It wasn't really clairvoyancy. It was just thank you.
Great. Thanks, Liana. We have 2 questions already asking us about what happens next after this book. But before we talk about that, let's take a look at a video of what this BEP 100 book is about. Please have a watch on this video.
BEP 100 is a book about architecture. It is a record of 100 years of revolutionary and progressive work of the Malaysian-based firm BEP Akitek, also known previously as Booty Edwards and Partners. The book is laid out chronologically, following the stories of pioneers such as Arthur Oakley Coltman, who revitalized the practice after enduring World War II, and Kington Liu, who as the first Malayan partner, exemplified professionalism, integrity, and accountability. Through 5 comprehensive chapters, the book establishes BEP's contribution in the shifting architectural landscape of Malaya to an independent and modernized Malaysia. Each chapter features an extensively researched essay that takes a step back as it looks at BEP in a wider socio-economic and political framework. Featuring articles on unpublished personal accounts as well as conversations with key members of the firm, the audience gains an insight into the lives of the people who were pivotal to the shaping and building of the Malaysia that we know today. Through a selection of architectural drawings and photographs retrieved from the firm's archives, these materials are now preserved in this book for future reference and study. BEP 100 will prove to be a valuable contribution to the discussions on Malaysia's urban development over the last 100 years.
So in answer to whether if there will be another book beyond this, we hope that there will be many books beyond this, not just books from within BEP Architect, but many other books about the discussions about architecture in Malaysia. So one of the things that we were really keen about is looking at new directions in which we can take this book and this discussion. So I'd like to pose this question to the writers. How do you think a book like this will actually affect the way we look at Malaysian architectural history or the trajectory of Malaysian architecture? What do you think, Robert? Would you like to have a go at this?
Yeah, my thinking was that I wanted to try and, as I said, mine all the sources of information, interview all the current and former directors, and interview people who had opinions on perhaps worked for the firm for a few years, and I wanted to relate a true account of the 100 years of BEP Architect. And I think when you do that, you obviously raise a lot of questions. Inevitably, my opinion on the veracity of some of the statements enters the discourse. For example, did Kington Lu design Duan Tunku Chancellor? Well, no, he didn't. It was Francis Paley who won the competition, and that's quite well documented. Did Kington Lu design Subang Airport? You'll find one answer in the book, but there may be other answers which people might want to pursue. Did BEP produce the master plan for Putrajaya that was selected by Dr. Mahathir? You'll find the answer in the book, or you'll find one answer in the book, and maybe that will start another discourse going on on that period. Did Kington Lu design Kenny Hill Estate? This was a question that was put to me just 2 weeks ago by someone who wanted to celebrate the design of Kenny Hill, and no, it wasn't. It was Arthur Coltman and Steed Hassan, the engineer, who used to go on evening walks around the estate, and the crescent was actually designed by Sito Kok Yen. So I discovered things which people had thought to be the truth for years and years and years, and we raised some questions in the book about the veracity of that. I think that's going to help to create other areas of research, and what we have had the advantage here of some primary resources, letters from, I have one letter here which I found really very interesting. This was a letter written by, it's not a letter, it's the foreword for an edition of PETA magazine. It's written by Kington Lu from the Hotel Merlin in Kuala Lumpur, and he writes, the populace began to, this is in 1957, the populace began to question the work of the profession and asked, is this building Malayan? So the question of identity was already being discussed in 1957. And that question is still being addressed. What is Malaysian architecture now? So it's as a boost to research. I think this book will be invaluable. Right across the 100 years, I think it's an invaluable source of research.
Yep. Thank you for that, Robert. Okay, perhaps just very quickly, in the quick 2 or 3 sentences, I'd like to pose this question to the writers. That when you're writing about BEP and you encountered the materials, what has been one exciting thing that you have found that will potentially springboard into further discussion or study? Let's start with you, Simon. What interesting thing have you encountered?
I don't know if there's only one, but really, I guess there are a few. One of them is the story of Esther Yuan, whose life, I guess, briefly, intersected with that of BEP's BEP, and her and the sister being touted as the first Asian woman being admitted to AA in 1930, but did not actually complete a course of study. I think trying to sort of like track her story is something that I am still pursuing with very promising leads. But the second is really, I'm very curious about this figure called Julius Kostner, who was really the architect behind the program at the technical school. And I think there's something about his time in KL that hasn't been given enough interpretive depth, given that he's left behind some very interesting and very rich body of writing that gave me a sense of something about KL's idiosyncrasies and how this would inform his understanding of architecture history, as well as the kind of research he would subsequently embark on in Germany later on in his life. And then there's also like new archives that I didn't know existed until much later, such as the collection of photographs shared online by Norman Leahy's son. A number of them were plans of modular timber houses that he designed for Felda planters. I mean, this in itself is another modern story about ambition, about transformation of our plantation landscape. I think all this is to suggest that we're really only at the beginning. And I hope that we don't think that book is offering any sort of like definitive authoritative sort of like is closing the chapter in any definitive authoritative term. Rather, I think the book is what I hope the book to be doing is that it should spark curiosity as well as inspire more research and writings on the history and architecture in our part of the world.
Thank you. Liyana, what about you? What is one exciting thing that you've encountered?
Same as Simon, it's a lot actually. But firms like BEP that has a legacy, they continue to make buildings grow on you over time. So I think finding out early on in the project that BEP was a pioneer in engineering how people lived with their first condominiums and service apartments, I think it's something that I would look into further into. It definitely echoes Hashim Sarkis's question of how will we live together. I think the pandemic has given this space for people to reorganize their spaces, question space of meetings, and I think the book itself, it's an opportune moment to do further look into how engineering in the engineering of how people lived, and this is a great time to actually start this with an optimistic outlook, though. I'm not being pessimistic here. Right, thank you.
Thanks, Liyana. Robert, what about you? I'm sure you found many exciting things.
Many things we're excited about, but one little thing, I would wonder how many people knew, other than a small number of people then perhaps knew, that the connection between BEP Akitek and Jeffrey Bauer. Bauer is a hero of mine, and I met the guy before he passed away, and he's been such a powerful influence on architecture in Southeast Asia. It's joining the dots that I find really quite exciting. The fact that the Edwards in Booty Edwards, which made on to BEP Architects, was also the Edwards in Edwards, Reed and Begg, which was the company that employed Jeffrey Bauer when he graduated from the AA at the age of 35. That connection quite excited me. I mean, there's no real value in that connection, but it just, it's little things like that which I thought that was quite interesting. Another little thing which is entirely personal is that for a short time I was an architect to a local council in the United Kingdom, and I did a conservation plan for a village called Cookfield in East Sussex. And then I found that in that very churchyard, that's where Copman was buried, and I'd actually been there. And I hadn't, of course, if I'd realized, I would have been looking around for the gravestones. But it's those little connections, joining the dots, as I say, which suddenly jump out, and they make the book, for me, quite an exciting journey. And it's been enlivened by those sort of connections. It's, as I said at the outset, it's never about, the destination. You don't. And when you're writing a book, it's a constantly, you're discovering things along the way.
Yeah. It's the idea of joining those dots that we continue to look forward to. So as per the poll in the beginning of this webinar, when we just asked you a simple question of whether you've worked in BEP, we actually are trying to recreate a BEP family tree. So like how Almaz has actually asked, or has actually commented in the Q&A box, that there have been hundreds or thousands of people who have actually gone through BEP, BEP doors. So if you are one of them, we would like to invite you to join us on our project, the small side project called the BEP Family Tree. There will be a link to a series of questions up on our Facebook page. So if you can if you're happy to participate, just let us know when were you actually in BEP over the last 100 years. And we hope to be able to map something interesting, but the time that we actually launch this book proper and sometime in June or July. So that's another one of those side projects that we are working on, amongst many other side projects that we have been that we're interested to look at. So do look out for that on our Facebook page. Okay. All right. So I think we have largely covered what we have wanted to present to you today. We hope.
Question there which came to Hussain. Someone currently doing their PhD research on Julius Posena's time in Malaysia. Wow, that's interesting. And because a number of the BEP people went through that training. That's brilliant. So there you are, something that is exciting.
Yeah.
I interrupted.
No, it's okay. Because one of the things that we have noticed as we were putting this book together is that there are many small pockets of research actually happening. So just like Anida, who's doing a PhD research on Julius Posner, there may be actually other people out there who have actually looked into Julius Posner. What about Norman Leahy? What about the Technical College? How do all these things fit in together? So we hope that it will be a point where different research and discussions can come together, and again to put together a more complete picture of what the last 100 years in Malaysia has been in terms of architectural development. So those are really exciting things for us to find out, and we hope that you will share that excitement with us too.
Worked with Booty and Edwards and Partners were Bertold Iverson, Xiao Yu-jin. I mean, wow, these are historic people.
Yes, that's right. So a lot of other characters you'll find in the book. So I'm sure many of you are wondering now where to get a copy of this. We will actually have a page up for you to do a booking for the book. It's currently with the printers, and we're expecting to be able to do a launch perhaps in June or July after Raya. The pandemic has set us back a bit on our schedule, because we actually want to have a big party at the University Malaya Great Hall, to go back to where the view that Simon gets from his office every day at the university is the Great Hall. Yeah, so do follow us on Facebook. We have a page for this publication. You will find more information there as to how you can actually book a copy of this book, how much it's going to cost. And we actually have an early bird price that will be available before the actual launch. So if you want a copy or 10 or 100 to distribute, please feel free to do a booking. All right, so we would like to thank all our panelists today. Thank you, Robert Powell, Simon Soon, and Liyana Hasnan. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the effort and the energies that you have thrown into making sure that we got this book done and that we managed to put it together. We also want to thank a lot of people behind the scenes that you don't see today. We have our technologists in Adapters, our publisher, a big team who's making sure that we got all the right things going for this webinar, and to enable us to use their offices as well for this webinar this afternoon. But most of all, we thank all of you who have actually been with us over the last hour. We hope it's been an exciting time for you. And we'll party together at the Great Hall when the time comes. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for a good afternoon. Have a great day.